Now there's a particular kind of tired that settles into a man's bones after too many miles of empty road, and Callum wore it like a second coat that late afternoon when he stopped at the gate of the Voss place. The sun was sinking hard and low in the west, blinding white through the dust haze, and he pulled his hat brim down against it the way a man does when he's been squinting at horizons for the better part of his life. His bedroll hung off one shoulder, worn smooth at the strap from 1,000 mornings of being slung up and carried on. He stood at that open gate a good long while, not moving, just looking. Behind him, the trail stretched back the way he'd come, flat and empty and forgiving of no one, the kind of road that takes more than it gives, and never apologizes for it. And ahead of him was a homestead that had clearly seen better days. The fence rails sagged, the yard had gone to weeds in places. Somewhere off to the side, a barn leaned at an angle no barn ought to lean, but it was the sign that caught him. Voss Farm, it read, painted once in proud white letters that had since faded and peeled until the wood beneath showed through like old bone. He reached up slow and let his fingertips just barely graze the cracked paint of those letters. There was something in the gesture that even he couldn't have named. A respect, maybe, for whoever had once stood here with a paintbrush and a future they believed in. A man who's drifted long enough learns to read a place the way he reads weather and men. And what this place told him was a story of someone holding on by their fingernails. He'd known that grip himself. He knew what it cost and what it left behind. For a moment he considered turning around. There was no warmth waiting for him here that he could see. No promise of anything but more work and more silence. But the truth was, Callum had nowhere else to be, and a man with nowhere to be is a man who can afford to be useful. So, he stood there a beat longer, breathing in the smell of dry grass and old wood, and the faint sweetness of wood smoke drifting from somewhere unseen. The light caught the long, thin scar along his jaw, souvenir from a life he didn't talk about, and for just an instant his expression softened into something almost like hope, though he'd have denied it to anyone who asked. He didn't ask much of the world anymore. A floor to sleep on, a reason to swing a hammer, a place where his hands could do some good before he moved along. He'd learned that the trail eventually took everything else a man owned, his name, his people, his certainties. But it could never quite take the work out of him, and the work was the one thing he still trusted. So he shifted the bedroll on his shoulder, pushed open the gate with the flat of his hand, and stepped across the threshold onto the property, his boots stirring up little ghosts of dust that hung gold in the dying light. He didn't know yet whose place this was. He didn't know the woman inside had buried a husband and half her dreams in the same hard season. He only knew, the way he always knew, that something here was broken, and that he was the kind of man who couldn't walk past broken things without stopping to see if they could be mended. The sun dropped lower. The shadows stretched long across the yard, and Callum walked up the path toward whatever waited for him at the Voss Farm. It was full dusk by the time Nora Voss heard the boots on her porch step, and her hand went to the broom handle before she even reached the door, because a woman alone on a failing homestead learns to greet the unexpected with something solid in her grip. She lit the lamp inside and brought it with her, so that when she opened the door, she stood framed in that warm light with her face half in shadow. And the man on her step was lit gold and uncertain before her. He'd taken off his hat. That was the first thing she noticed. He held it in both hands, turning the brim slow between his fingers, and his eyes were down, fixed on the worn boards of her porch, as if he hadn't, the right to look at her directly. Folks who meant harm didn't generally bother taking off their hats. Still, Nora had been fooled before by smiles and soft words, and men who promised the world and delivered nothing but more trouble than she'd started with. So she crossed her arms over her chest and let the silence stretch, studying him the way you'd study a horse you weren't sure you wanted to buy. He was lean and weathered, dust caked into the creases of his clothes, a scar riding the line of his jaw. He didn't fidget under her stare the way a guilty man might. He just waited, patient, until she finally said, "You're a long way from anywhere, mister." And he nodded slow and said his name was Callum, that he'd been on the trail some weeks, that he could see she had work needed doing, and he could do it in exchange for a roof and whatever food she could spare. Nora let out a tired breath that was almost a laugh. She'd heard offers before. There wasn't a drifter alive who didn't think he could charm a meal out of a widow. "I've got no money to pay a hand," she told him flat, "and no spare room neither, and I'll thank you not to expect more than I've got." He nodded again, and then he said the words that stuck with her long after, the words she'd turn over in her mind on the sleepless nights to come. "I'll take the floor, ma'am," he said, his voice low and even, and somehow gentler than a face like his had any right to carry. "I'll take the floor and make no trouble," that was all. No grand promises, no flattery, no leaning forward with hungry eyes. Just a man offering to sleep on her bare planks and asking for nothing but the chance to earn his keep. The tin lantern hung unlit beside her door, the one her husband Tom had bought the spring before he passed, and she found her eyes drifting to it for reasons she couldn't quite say. Maybe it was the way Callum reminded her, just a little, of the quiet steadiness Tom had carried in his better years. Maybe it was only that she was so bone-weary of doing everything alone that any offer of help, however unlikely, struck her like rain on parched ground. She knew what the neighbors would say. A widow, taking in a strange man, letting him sleep under her roof. The whispers would ride the trail to town before the week was out, but Nora Voss had run out of room in her heart for what other folks thought. She had a collapsed barn and a failing crop, and a future that grew thinner by the day. And standing on her porch was a man with strong hands and tired eyes who asked only for a floor. She uncrossed her arms. "And mind you keep your word about the trouble." He kept it. That was the thing about Callum that Nora would come to understand in the days that followed. When the man gave his word, it wasn't a thing made of breath and wind. It was made of iron. That first night she lay awake in her own bed, listening to the small sounds of a stranger in her house, half expecting the creak of him rising, the soft tread of bad intentions crossing her floor. But there was nothing. Only the long, even rhythm of a man sleeping the honest sleep of the genuinely exhausted. And when she rose before dawn, as she always did, pulled from her bed by worries that wouldn't let her rest, she crept to the doorway of the front room and looked in on him in the blue pre-dawn light that came slanting through the single cracked window. What she saw stayed with her. He lay on the bare plank floor, exactly as he'd said he would, his bedroll unrolled beneath him, but his body still wrapped in his long duster against the cold, because his hat sat placed neat beside his boots, the boots themselves lined up square and proper at the edge of the bedroll, toes pointed to the door. There was something almost soldierly in the order of it, a discipline that spoke of a life lived under rules, whether of the army or the trail or some harder schooling she couldn't guess at. But more than the order, it was the care that struck her. Here was a man who could have taken liberties, could have stretched out across her hearth, could have helped himself to the comfort of her late husband's chair, could have done any of 100 small thefts of comfort that a guest might excuse to himself. He'd done none of it. He'd taken the floor, the literal floor, and not an inch more, as if measuring out the exact size of the promise he'd made and refusing to spill over its edges by even a breath. Nora stood in that doorway and felt something shift inside her, some small stone moving in a wall. She'd built up brick by careful brick since the day they'd lowered Tom into the ground. It wasn't trust, not yet. Trust took longer than a night, but it was the first faint crack of light through a door she'd nailed shut. She found herself thinking about the kind of life that taught a man to keep so small a word, a man who'd been let down, maybe by others, who broke theirs. A man who'd decided somewhere along the dusty miles that his word was the one thing the world couldn't strip from him, and so he held it the tighter for that. She thought, too, about her own loneliness. The great hollow weight of it, the way the farm had grown too large and too empty around her, every chore a reminder of the man who used to share it. She'd told herself she didn't need anyone. She told herself that so many times it had worn a groove in her like a wagon track in soft earth. And yet here was the proof of how badly she'd been lying, that the mere sight of a stranger sleeping honest on her floor could make her throat go tight and her eyes sting in the cold blue dark. She backed away quiet before he could wake and find her watching. She went to the stove and built up the fire and set the coffee on. And when the smell of it filled the house, she heard him stir, heard the careful sounds of a man rising and rolling his bedroll and setting himself to rights. By the time he came into the kitchen, hat in hand again, she had a cup poured for him on the table. "Floor treat you, all right?" she asked, not quite looking at him. "Better than the ground, ma'am," he said. And the faintest ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. After he'd drunk his coffee and eaten the plain bread and bacon she set before him, Callum asked her to show him the worst of it, and Nora knew without asking what he meant. So she led him out into the sunrise, across the yard, wet with dew, to where the barn stood, or rather, where the barn had given up standing. They stopped together before the ruin of it, and, for a long moment, neither one spoke. In the clean light of morning, the wreckage looked even worse than it did in shadow. Half the timber frame had buckled inward, the great old beams that Tom and his father before him had raised, now snapped and leaning like the ribs of some fallen beast. The roof had caved to one side, the shingles spilled across the ground in a long gray drift, and the whole structure had the sorrowful sag of a thing that had finally surrendered to time and weather and neglect. Nora folded her arms tight across herself, the way she did when something hurt too much to look at straight. That barn had been the heart of the place once. Tom had been proud of it, had kept it sound and dry and full, and watching it fall to pieces these 2 years since his passing had felt like watching the last of him crumble away. The winter storms had finished what her grief had begun, and she hadn't the means, nor the men, nor the will to set it right. Without a barn, she couldn't shelter stock through the cold. Without stock, the farm couldn't pay. Without the farm paying, she'd lose the land, and losing the land meant losing the last thing on this earth that was hers, the last place that still held the shape of the life she'd built. She'd done the arithmetic of her ruin 100 times in the dark, and it always came out the same. But Callum wasn't doing arithmetic. He'd crouched down low beside a fallen beam And as she watched, he pressed his broad palm flat against the wood, slow and deliberate, the way a doctor might press a hand to a fevered brow. He ran his fingers along the grain, testing the soundness of it, knocking once with his knuckles to hear how the timber answered. He moved to another beam and did the same. He looked up at the angle of the buckled frame, squinting, and she could near about see the figures turning behind his eyes, the measuring and reckoning of a man who'd built things before, and knew how they stood and how they fell. "This here's still good," he said low, almost to himself, tapping a length of timber, "and this? Most of the frame's sound, just thrown out of true. It's the corner post gave way and pulled the rest with it." He stood and turned a slow circle, taking in the whole of it, and there was no despair in his face, the way there'd been in hers all these long months. There was only the calm consideration of a problem that could be solved. "It can be raised again," he said. "Take time. Take new timber for the posts and the rafters. But the bones of it are good." Between them, on a fence post, sat the tin lantern, the one from beside her door carried out without either of them quite deciding to bring it, and the morning sun caught its battered tin and made it shine. Nora looked from the lantern to the man, to the ruin of her barn, and for the first time in 2 long years she let herself imagine it standing whole again. It frightened her, that imagining. Hope was a dangerous thing for a woman who'd had so much taken from her, but Callum was already rolling up his sleeves. "Where'd Tom keep his tools?" he asked, and she found her voice and told him. He started that very day, and he started alone, because that was how the work first came to him. Nora had her own chores, the garden and the chickens and the cow that still gave milk and the 100 small tasks that kept a homestead from sliding entirely into ruin. And so for those first days, Callum labored by himself in the wreckage, while she watched from a distance, half disbelieving. As a man swung a sledgehammer in the heat of her yard for no wages but a place on her floor. By midday the sun stood hard and white overhead, the kind of merciless prairie sun that beats down on a man's neck like a flat hand, and Callum had stripped to a chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled past the elbow. The sweat had soaked clean through the back of it and darkened it down the spine, and the muscles of his forearms stood corded and hard as he raised that sledge and brought it down again and again, driving a fresh-cut timber post deep into the cracked and stubborn earth. Each blow rang out across the empty land, a steady ringing rhythm, and the scar along his jaw caught the light each time he turned his head. There was something almost holy in the way he worked, a kind of devotion, though he'd have laughed at the word. He didn't rush, and he didn't slack. He found a pace a body could keep all day, and he kept it, the way only a man who'd done hard labor all his life knew how to do. And here was the thing that stopped Nora's breath when she finally walked out to bring him water. All around him, where there had been chaos and rubble and the scattered bones of her ruined barn, there was now order. He'd spent the morning sorting the sound lumber he'd pulled free and stacked in neat, orderly rows by length and thickness, the rotten pieces he'd dragged off to a separate pile to be burned. He'd salvaged every nail that could be salvaged, drawing the bent ones and straightening them on a flat stone, and the hand-forged nails sat sorted in tin cans by size. He'd found Tom's old tools, oiled and cleaned the rust from them, and laid them out along a board in a row so straight you could have sighted a rifle down it. Out of the wreckage of her grief, this stranger was conjuring order, plain and patient, one salvaged board and one straightened nail at a time. She handed him the dipper of water, and he drank it down in long swallows and thanked her, and when she looked at the work he'd done, she felt her eyes prickle again, the way they had in the doorway that first dawn. "It's coming along," he said simply and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. She wanted to ask him why. Why a man would break his back in the killing sun for a widow he'd known 2 days, for a floor to sleep on and bread to eat, work he could have found easier elsewhere, and for actual coin. But she didn't ask, because some part of her feared that to name the kindness might somehow break the spell of it, might remind him that he owed her nothing and send him on down the trail. So instead, she only said, "You'll want more than bread tonight. Working like that, I'll cook something proper." And he looked at her with those tired, steady eyes and nodded once and went back to his hammer. The sound of it followed her all the way back to the house. That steady ring of iron on timber, and she realized as she walked that it was the first sound in 2 years that didn't feel like loss. It felt like a promise being kept, blow by blow, in the heat of a hard, bright day. It was on the 4th day that Nora set down her own work and walked out to the barn and picked up a board, and Callum didn't say a word about it, which was exactly the right thing not to say. She'd watched him long enough by then to understand that the work was too much for one man, that for all his strength and stubbornness, there were tasks that simply needed a second pair of hands. A man can't hold a crossbeam level and drive the nail at the same time. A man can't steady a thing from above and fasten it from below. And so, without any grand announcement, without asking permission or making a fuss of it, Nora Voss climbed the ladder against the rising frame and took hold of the heavy crossbeam and held it true while Callum hammered it home from beneath. The late afternoon sun had gone golden by then, that rich amber light that comes near the end of a long working day, and it poured across the plain and lit the new timber of the rebuilt frame so that it glowed warm against the sky. She gripped that beam with both hands and held it steady, her arms aching, her chin level and her jaw set, and she was not helping reluctantly, not doing it because she felt she ought. She was doing it because it was her barn and her land, and her future taking shape under her hands. And somewhere in those 4 days, she had decided she would not stand by and watch a stranger build it for her. She would build it with him. Below her, Callum drove the nails with sure, clean strokes, pausing now and again to call up a word. "A little to your left, ma'am," or "Hold her right there," and she answered with grunts and small adjustments, the two of them working in a rhythm. And as he hammered that crossbeam tight, as the frame took the weight and held it, both of them saw the same thing at the same moment. The first true sign that the barn would stand again. It wasn't a pile of lumber any longer. It wasn't a ruin. It was the skeleton of a real building, square and rising, and the long amber shadows of its frame fell across the dirt of the yard in a pattern that hadn't fallen there in 2 years. Nora looked at those shadows and felt her throat close. From up on the ladder, she could see clear out across her land, the fields and the fences and the far blue line of the hills. And for the first time since Tom died, she saw it not as a burden too heavy to carry. She came down the ladder slow when the beam was set, and she stood beside Callum and looked up at the frame they'd raised together. And she said, quiet, "Tom would have liked you. He didn't take to most folks, but he'd have liked you." Callum was quiet a moment. Then he said, "A man builds a thing like this. He leaves a part of himself in it." He pointed up at the old salvage beams they'd worked back into the frame, the sound timber Tom himself had raised. "He's still in here, ma'am. We just gave him a place to stand again." Nora had to turn away then, had to busy herself gathering the tools, because the kindness of it was more than she could carry in her face. But something had changed in her, in that golden light, holding that beam, watching it whole. The grief that had filled her these 2 years hadn't gone. Grief like that never truly goes, but it had made room beside itself for something else, for hope, for the steady, ringing certainty that she was not, after all, entirely alone in the world. Word travels on the wind out on the prairie, faster than any horse, and it wasn't long before the neighbors began to notice that something was happening at the Voss place. For 2 years they'd ridden past it, with their eyes turned politely away, the way decent folks avert their gaze from a thing too sorrowful to look at: the sagging fences, the weed-choked yard, the collapsed and rotting barn that stood as a kind of monument to a woman's slow defeat. They'd pitied Nora in the way that pity often is, from a comfortable distance, with much shaking of heads and little offering of hands. Some had whispered, too, when word got round that she'd taken in a strange drifting man to live under her roof. Folks always whisper. But now, as the wagons came and went along the trail, the riders found their eyes drawn back to Voss Farm. Not in pity this time, and not in scandal, but in plain astonishment. Because where there had been a ruin, a barn was rising. The clean new timber of its frame stood sharp against the sky, plumb and square and growing taller by the day, and the whole place had begun to shed its look of defeat, the way a field sheds snow in spring. On this particular afternoon, a wagon slowed on the trail, and the 2 figures on the seat, a farmer and his wife, from a place some miles north, reined in their team to look. And Nora, who 2 years ago would have fled into the house at the sight of company, who would have hidden from their questions and their kindly condescension, instead walked out to the fence and stood before her rising barn and spoke to them easy and unhurried, her posture open and her head held high. She told them what they could see for themselves, that she was rebuilding, that the worst was behind her now. She didn't explain Callum, didn't make excuses or apologies for the man hammering away behind her. She simply let them see what was plainly true, that the Voss Farm was coming back to life, and that the woman who owned it had come back to life along with it. It was a small thing, that conversation across a fence, but it was a turning, and Nora felt the weight of it. For 2 years she had turned away from the eyes of her neighbors, ashamed of her ruin and her grief and her failure to hold together the life Tom had left in her keeping. Now she stood and let them look, because there was no longer shame in what they saw. There was only the honest evidence of hard work and stubborn hope. The farmer's wife called down that she was glad to see it, glad to see the old place mending, and there was a warmth in her voice that hadn't been there in the careful pity of years past. And Nora found she could answer that warmth in kind. When the wagon rolled on, she stood watching it go down the long flat trail, and she felt the eyes of the whole community shifting back toward her, the way a flower turns back toward the sun. She was no longer the poor widow Voss, the cautionary tale the woman folks didn't quite know how to speak to. She was becoming something else, a woman rebuilding, a woman to be respected, a woman whose name might mean something again. Behind her, the steady ring of Callum's hammer went on, and she understood with a quiet surprise that he was not only mending her barn, he was mending her standing in the eyes of every soul who passed, her place among her own people, the very name she carried. He had said he'd make no trouble. He had made, instead, a kind of quiet miracle, and he'd made it the way he did everything, without ever once asking to be thanked for it. The day they finished the last of the frame and hung the great doors true on their new iron hinges, Nora went into the house and came back out with a can of white paint and a brush, and she walked to the old wooden sign that stood by the gate, the one Callum had grazed with his fingertips on the day he first arrived, though she didn't know that yet. Voss Farm, it had read, in letters faded near to nothing, peeled down to gray, bare wood, a sign as worn and beaten as the place it named. She'd meant to repaint it for 2 years, and never had, because to take up the brush would have meant admitting that the farm and the name on it were still hers to tend, still worth the tending. Now she knelt before the sign in the clean light, and she loaded her brush full of fresh white paint, and she set the tip of it to the first letter and began, slow and careful, to retrace the name. Her hand was steady. That surprised her. She'd half expected it to shake, but it moved, sure, and even along the old grooves of the letters, the V and the O and the 2 S's, laying down bright new paint over the ghost of the old, and the name came back to life beneath her brush, like something rising up out of deep water into the air. And as she worked, without a word passing between them, Callum's dusty hand came into view and pressed flat against the far end of the sign, holding it steady against the fence post so it wouldn't shift under her brushstrokes. She hadn't asked him to. He'd simply seen what was needed and done it, the way he'd done everything since the night he came to her door. Only their 2 hands were at the work now, hers wielding the brush and his holding the wood firm, and there was no need for either of them to speak. The collaboration had become wordless and exact, the easy understanding of 2 people who had labored side by side long enough to know each other's movements before they were made. She painted the name of her dead husband, the name she had married into and nearly lost, the name that had hung in defeat over a ruined homestead, and she painted it proud and white and legible again, and all the while the man who had made it possible held the sign steady and asked for nothing. When she came to the last letter, she paused, brush hovering, and she thought about all that name had meant, and all it had lost, and all it might yet mean again. It was Tom's name. But it was hers too, and she understood now that she had been letting it fade, because she'd been letting herself fade right along with it. No more. She finished the final stroke and sat back on her heels and looked at it, the bright new Voss Farm, gleaming wet in the sun. And she felt a fierce and unfamiliar pride swell up in her chest. Callum lifted his hand away from the sign, slow, careful not to smudge the wet paint, and he stood up and looked at it too. "Looks like it ought to," he said, and that was all. Looks like it ought to. And Nora, kneeling there in the dirt with paint on her fingers and her dead husband's name shining new before her, understood that the man had given her back something far greater than a barn. He had given her back her name. He had given her back herself. They finished the barn at dusk, on an evening when the whole western sky had gone the color of a banked fire, a deep burnt orange that spilled across the land and set the new timber glowing. And when the last board was nailed, and the last task done, the 2 of them stepped back and stood in the yard and looked at what they had made. The barn rose solid and plumb against that burning sky, square and true and sound, every line of it clean, every joint tight, a real and lasting thing where 2 years of ruin had stood. It was bigger than the old one had seemed, or maybe it only stood prouder, the way a thing stands when it's built with care by hands that meant it to endure. Nora walked to the great open doorway and stood within it, and above her hung from a hook on the new frame the tin lantern burned, Tom's lantern, the one that had hung unlit beside her door for 2 long years, the one that had ridden out to the wreckage on a fence post on that first morning. She had lit it at last. Its small, warm flame glowed gold in the gathering dark, and the light of it fell soft across her face and out into the yard, and it was the most beautiful thing Callum thought he had ever seen. That lantern lit, that doorway whole, that woman standing in it unafraid. He sat a few paces off on the top rail of the new fence, his hat tipped back on his head, one boot hooked on the rail below. But he was not looking at the barn. He had built the barn, and the barn no longer needed his looking. He was gazing out instead at the horizon, where the last of the light bled away into the coming night, and the long, flat trail ran on toward whatever lay beyond it. There was a stillness in him, the particular stillness of a man whose work is finished. He had felt it before at the end of other labors in other places, that quiet, hollow knowing that comes when a job is done, and a man has no more reason to stay. Nora called to him from the doorway, "Come see it from in here." But Callum only smiled, faint and tired and kind, and shook his head a little, and went on watching the horizon. He'd seen it. He'd seen all of it. Every board and beam, knew it better than he knew most things. What he was looking at now was the road, and the road was telling him what the road always told him, that he'd done what he came to do, that this place was whole now, and a whole place had no more need of a man who fixed broken things. The lantern light glowed behind him, and the night came on, and somewhere a coyote called out long and lonesome across the dark prairie. Nora watched him from the doorway, this strange, quiet man who had walked out of the dust and given her back her whole life, and some understanding passed over her, some sorrow she couldn't name. He was a builder of things, she saw, a mender. But a man like that belonged to the broken places, and there would always be another broken place down the trail, another ruin, another soul in need of the steady ring of his hammer. He could no more stay in a finished thing than the wind could stop and settle. She looked at him sitting there against the dying fire of the sky, and she knew, the way you know, the turning of a season. He was gone by morning. Nora woke in the earliest gray dawn, before the sun had cleared the hills, woke to a silence in the house that she felt in her chest before her mind could name it. She rose and went to the front room, and the floor was bare. The bedroll was gone. The hat was gone. The careful square arrangement of a man's few belongings gone as if it had never been. He had folded the blanket she'd finally given him and left it stacked neat on the chair, and beside it on the table sat the coffee cup he'd used, washed and dried and set down clean. That was all. No note, for she suspected he was not a man easy with letters. And besides, there was nothing a note could have said that the work itself hadn't already said, louder. She went to the window and looked out, and there, far down the long flat trail, she saw him. A lone figure walking away into the gray, his bedroll tied and slung over his shoulder again the way it had been the day he came, his back to her and to the farm and to everything he'd built. He did not turn around. She understood that he wouldn't. A man like Callum didn't look back, because looking back was for men who left things undone, and he had left nothing undone. In the foreground, sharp and clear and legible in the soft dawn light, stood the sign she had painted with her own hand and he had held steady with his VOSSSAN, bright white and proud, the name restored, the future it promised, no longer a lie. The man who had rebuilt everything was walking away with nothing. He carried no coin, for she'd had none to give him. He carried no thanks, spoken aloud, for he'd never stayed still long enough to let her say them proper. He carried only what he'd carried in, a bedroll, a hat, the clothes on his back, and whatever it was inside a man that drove him to mend the broken places of the world, and then move on before they could mend him in return. Nora stood at the window and watched until he was only a speck against the lightening sky, and then not even that, until the trail swallowed him the way it swallows all such men in the end. And she found she was not weeping, though her heart was full near to breaking. She was standing tall in the doorway of her own restored home on her own restored land, with her name shining new on the sign by the gate, and a sound barn standing whole behind her, and a lantern she now knew how to light. He had taken nothing from her. He had left her everything. That was the kind of man he was, and the kind there are too few of, and the kind whose passing folks remember long after they've forgotten the names of richer and louder men. Years later, when she was old and her grandchildren ran in the shade of the barn he'd raised, Nora Voss would tell them of the drifter who came one evening out of the dust with his eyes downturned and his hat in his hands, who asked for nothing but a place on the floor and gave back a whole life in return. She'd tell them how he kept his every word, how he labored in the killing sun for a stranger, how he rebuilt her barn, and her name, and her hope, and then walked away down the trail at dawn. And she'd tell them what she came to understand only after he'd gone, that the floor he took had cost him nothing, but the gift he left had cost him everything. A wandering man has to give. And somewhere out there, on some other dusty trail, before some other ruin, she liked to believe he was building still.